Hey guys, we are back updating the Power Rankings for Survivor 44 following the merge episode. And it was, I don't know, not the best. I felt like the boot was pretty predictable. I felt like the actual vote wasn't the most interesting either. However, I am hoping that things start to pick up in the coming episodes. But there are 12 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 12, we have the merge boot of the season, but here we have Josh. And like I said, I found this to be pretty predictable. I felt like it had been set up now for the last couple of episodes, and I feel like this episode didn't really hide it that well, where early on he got this content about feeling like overconfident, like he is shown to be on the wrong side of things. We hear people say that they don't particularly trust him, and I felt like once we saw the team lose the challenge, that was pretty clear he was the most likely boot. Now, granted, I said last week that he wasn't the only contender that I had for the merge boot. However, he definitely was one of the more likely options, and him being the one to go here isn't that surprising. And his game overall was pretty mediocre, where he was pretty much on the bottom the entire time. He would have gone home at the first vote, except for the fact that he was better in challenges physically. He would have gone home next if it weren't for the swap. Even after the swap, he would have been the first boot if he wasn't handed an idol. Would have been the boot had they gone to tribal again, except for Matthew pulling himself from the game. And then now he was just being taken out. I felt like it was a very underwhelming game. I would imagine he'd be pretty low on my merge boot ranking if I ever were to do that. But the game itself was pretty underwhelming as a whole. I felt like he is someone that definitely had the chance to work with people. And we even heard people like Claire talking about wanting to work with him. Even Jam Jam is someone he expressed interest in working in. However, he didn't seem to be good enough socially to build bonds with those people that allowed them to not really trust him. And I felt like he was largely holding back. I felt like he wasn't able to effectively lie about his occupation. And I felt like in general, he wasn't able to build the bonds that would have allowed him to work well in the game. Not to mention the fact that he thought he was in the middle the whole time. He thought he was on this great position on Soka, only for people to say that he would have been the next boot. So I feel like that's not great either. In general, not too much to praise with this game. And obviously, he didn't really have much of a shot based on his edit, which is a big reason he is here at number 12. And with that, there are 11 players left in the game to talk about. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they're to win based on their edit and current game position. But at number 11, I did decide to go with someone who was a bit higher last week, but I did decide to bump them down here. But here we have Lauren. And Lauren pretty much got no content in this episode. Now, she did get to share that she had an extra vote, but even then, that wasn't really much of a confessional. She just said it to the tribe. And yes, she was shown talking about voting out Kane with Heidi, although that doesn't really lead anywhere. And in general, I feel like this is just more of the same for Lauren. And admittedly, she isn't as actively bad in her edit compared to other people. However, the fact that she didn't really get much of anything in what should be an important episode for the season is a pretty big knock for me, and a big reason I have her at the bottom at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I have had consistently low on my power rankings, but here we have Jamie Lynn. And realistically, I feel like there's more you can knock against Jamie's edit. Even in this episode, she seems to once again be pretty overconfident with her position. She calls herself the MVP since she has information from two different tribes, even though that isn't really backed up in any way. And in general, I find Jamie's content to be very lackluster. However, the reason I have her above Lauren is that she at least got more content this episode. You know, she did get several confessionals, like sharing her point of view, even if it's not one that lends itself to her being in that great of a spot. However, the fact that she at least got content was enough to have her above Lauren, but realistically, she's not winning either, which is a big reason she's here number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have someone who has continued to slide in recent weeks on my power rankings, but here we have Brandon. And Brandon's episode was very much a mixed bag. I felt like he didn't really get much personal content here, and a lot of his content was talking about wanting to take the shot at Kane, given Kane voted for him at the first tribal. He doesn't trust Kane and really wanted to vote for Kane, only for him to vote for Jam Jam. Now, granted, you could argue that this isn't as bad considering, oh, well, this could just shown that he was willing to vote for a backup target in case Josh's idol was real. But obviously, we know that Josh's idol isn't real, and the fact that he seemed to believe it is a pretty bad sign there. And obviously, the fact that he talked so much about specifically Kane, only for him to not even vote for Kane, despite Kane getting a vote at this tribal, was enough to knock him down to number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have someone who is closely related to Brandon, but here we have Danny. And Danny was a lot more quiet in this merge episode. He didn't really have much to do here outside of talking to Jam Jam before the vote and him saying that, oh, we'll just talk to the winning team about voting for Josh. And that was used to show Jam Jam's concern that he made this big mistake, even though it didn't really backfire on him. I feel like Danny is not well suited moving forward. I could very well see like him trying to make this group come together only for it to fall apart. And you could say that him voting out Josh here is a pretty suboptimal move, considering Josh talks in his interview about wanting to work with Danny, mind you, as a meat shield. But obviously, Josh also could have been a number for this bro alliance if this were a thing. But again, I feel like Danny wasn't as undercut in this episode as Brandon, where Brandon is actively shown talking about taking out Kane, only for him to not actually do so. I feel like Danny didn't really have that to undercut him. But at the end of the day, he was still undermined enough in previous episodes to where I feel like he's pretty unlikely to win, which is a big reason I have him here at number 8. Now I'm moving on to number 7, and I feel like this person didn't have a terrible episode on paper, but I'm still very worried for their short-term prospects. But here we have Franny. And I've continued to say this before, but I still think that Franny is going to be cut before Matt. And this episode seemed to focus quite a bit on their relationship, and yes, that is sort of a positive, but I still feel like it's being set up for them to be targeted within the next couple of rounds, especially with the coming attractions showing that they could be in trouble coming to this next tribal. And if they are, I could see Franny being cut there. But even outside that, I feel like Franny's edit is in line with that of an early merge boot, which is pretty worrying there. And in general, I feel like the content that she got in this episode wasn't that great either. It was mostly this baseline content of her talking about Josh maybe having an idol, Josh barely surviving, he's going to be like Superman. And then obviously she talks about voting for Kane or Jam Jam as part of the split vote plan. I mean, whatever. Obviously her relationship with Matt, which has been a pretty big focus up to this point. Again, I feel like there are so many warning signs for me that Franny is going to be cut and, again, be collateral damage in a move made against Matt. But still, compared to the other people, I feel like she has a bit more going for her in her edit, which is a big reason she is here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and I'm actually a little surprised by how high this person is, considering how low I've been on them throughout the season. But here we have Kane, and this was actually a good episode for Kane. Now, obviously, you could say that some of it's circumstantial, given that he was being targeted at one point. He was seen as one of the potential backup options if Josh really did have an idol. But even so, we get plenty from Kane's perspective. We see him working to get the votes onto Jam Jam instead, which is mostly effective. He is also shown talking about his relationship with Carson, and we see Carson work very hard to get the votes off Kane, and which is a good follow-up to what we saw in the previous episode, and especially knowing now that Carson is seeming to be a part of Kane's alliance, which is something at least. Now, realistically, I still don't think Kane's winning. I feel like this is more so circumstantial than anything else. And even then, you can say that Carson's true allegiance is more to the Tika members than to Kane at the end of the day. But still, the fact that he got this content with his name out there and in danger is enough to have him a bit higher. And plus, I feel like now that he's survived the merch run, I feel like I could see him surviving a bit further into the game. I could see him making a more deep run than I give him credit for before. But at the end of the day, I still don't think there's enough for a win there, so I do have to leave him here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and even though this person didn't really drop that much in their placement on this ranking, I feel like my view of their win equity has gone down a good amount. But here we have Heidi, and at this point, I don't think Heidi is winning, as she didn't really get that much in this episode. I mean, again, the merge episode is usually an important episode for the winner's edit, and the fact that she only gets this brief confessional talking about how she seems pretty open about the vote just doesn't really give me much confidence. And at the end of the day, I feel like her storyline of being underestimated has not really been followed up upon at all. Now, granted, it could still pick up more as the post-merge goes along, but the fact that she doesn't really get much of anything in this merge episode, and in general, we just haven't seen much for her at this point. I feel like at this point, I'm probably going to write her off as a contender. But compared to everyone else, I feel like she still has more pros going for her. And I could see her making a deeper run. Although at the end of the day, I think if I had to guess, she's probably going to be this endgame threat, sort of similar to what we saw from Lindsay from Survivor 42. This player that gets enough content to justify her making a deep run, but then she just magically mounts as this big threat to be taken out towards the endgame. And you can expect that she's going to be taken out at that point. So I feel like there's that going for her, the longevity aspect. But in terms of her actually winning, I just don't see it there at this point. So because of that, she is here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and it is the same top 4 that I had last week. As realistically, I think the winner will most likely be one of these 4, as I feel like everyone else beyond this point is either dead or really on the fringe. But at number 4, I did decide to make a change here, and here we have Jam Jam. And it's tough because I do think Jam Jam is part of the complex tribe, and I think through that we could expect to see Atika win more likely than not. And with Jam Jam being a part of that, I think Jam Jam is naturally elevated because of that. However, I'm not gonna lie, I did find this episode a bit underwhelming from Jam Jam's end, where despite him getting this content about feeling alone and him like really regrouping, I feel like other people got more credit for that, namely Carson, for instance. And I feel like we haven't really seen much to perpetuate a storyline for Jam Jam. And I feel like so much of this episode was centered around his rivalry with Josh, which obviously paid off there. I had never had any doubt that Jam Jam would stay over Josh. But realistically, I feel like this episode didn't really do much to prop him up. And I feel like Jan Jan doesn't seem like a super obvious contender at this point. However, compared to everyone else, I still feel like he has a lot going for him, like him being on the complex tribe, with him seeming to be a major character on the season, and again, the match chat stuff. But realistically, I feel like this episode didn't do much to make me prop him up, which is a big reason he is here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and I actually debated these next two as I feel like they have different pros and cons going for them. But at number 3, I did decide to stick with the same person I had last week at the spot, but here we have Matt from San Francisco. And I thought this was a good episode for Matt. He gets a check in on his relationship with Franny. He gets plenty of narrational content where he talks about Josh being a big threat. He talks about how he wants there to be a big majority given he can't vote, which obviously comes together with the vote being essentially a unanimous vote with only a couple stray votes due to the potential Josh having an idol. And he gets this interesting confessional right before Tribal where he describes the merge and he talks about how there's so many personalities and relationships now, how it's all a gamble and that now they're playing Survivor with a capital S. And then even at Tribal, he gets this very interesting analogy talking about how you're going down the mountain skiing and you're seeing all the stuff flying by, and then you have to make a judgment call based off that. I think in general, Matt got a lot of good narrational content in this episode. And with his relationship with Franny being a focus, I feel like that's going to be set up for him losing Franny at some point, which in turn will perpetuate his storyline as well. Now, at the end of the day, I still think there's a number of things going against Matt, like the fact that he's not on the complex tribe. Also, the fact that despite him getting this narrational content, it's possible that he himself could fall victim to this at some point. But still, compared to everyone else, I still feel like this was a good episode for Matt, and I think there's a lot of potential for him moving forward. But it's the fact that he's not on the complex tribe that leaves him here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this was a pretty clear number 2 for me, but here we have Carson. And I still think a lot of the same concerns with Carson applies. I still feel like he's getting too much screen time, and I feel like in general he is being set up to be this big character. But I'm not gonna lie, this was actually a pretty solid episode for Carson where it gets plenty of strategic content with him talking about like getting the vote off of Kane, given his relationship there. He is shown talking with Jam Jam and Carolyn about sticking together as part of the Tika tribe. And considering that Tika is a complex tribe based on what we got from the pre-merge, I think that's pretty good content there. The fact that he gets credit for that. And in general, he gets to talk plenty about the game. I mean, he obviously wins the challenge and talks about how he, once again, 3D printed a challenge just to practice at home, which is pretty good there. And in general, I feel like in a lot of ways, this is more the same for Carson. And I still have those same concerns, which was a big reason he's not at number 1. However, I still feel like everything else is pretty solid. I feel like he got a lot of credit in this episode, and I feel like he'll continue to be a big character moving forward. But still, I have all those concerns that he's probably going to be cut towards the end, which is a big reason that he's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 44 right now is still Carolyn. Now, again, say what you will about Carolyn, that this episode, from a pure game perspective, wasn't ideal, where she was the one person to throw her vote onto Kane, made it seem on the surface that she was left completely out of this plan, although, you could debate like whether it was part of the split vote, but we'll certainly need more information to confirm this. However, considering the fact that she was left out of this vote, I feel like this episode was probably the best case scenario for Carolyn in terms of how it was presented, where she got plenty of content early on talking about how it feels weird fitting in, but you can't force it. Like she gets all this content about her struggling to fit in after the challenge. Like she obviously tries to tell the others that Josh's idol is fake, only for them to not listen to her. She gets a confessional talking about that. She talks about trusting Jam Jam 94%, but trusts Carson 99.9%, which I did find a bit interesting and could potentially lead to her turning against him later on. But even so, in the meantime, Tika is a complex tribe. Like we see them coming together in that confessional. She talks about how she plans to move forward, how she needs to trust her gut. And obviously, while she has left out this plan, I feel like we are very likely to get follow up on that in the following episode, where this is just going to perpetuate her storyline of her being underestimated, how no one listens to her. And I just feel like all this is going to grow until she eventually makes her move to where she's going to make a move and start to be taken seriously. I think despite what actually happened within the episode, Carolyn herself was not undermined the edit. Like if Carolyn were not the winner, it would have been so easy for her to be presented as this lunatic, as being completely on the outs. But because she has continued to be shown pretty positively despite all this, and considering that all of this is in line with their storyline of her being underestimated and no one really listening to her, I think this is probably the best case scenario for Carolyn. And because of that, I did decide to leave Carolyn once again at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the Power Rankings again, so stay tuned for that. I'm currently covering Big Brother Canada 11 and doing weekly Power Rankings of that as well, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which you can join by clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that's the video. See ya.